Hey gang, welcome to your first screencast since we've been back from winter break. Today we are going to be talking about cellular respiration. This is a process that is critically important to all living things on Earth. All life does cellular respiration in some form or another. You should know that the overall goal of cellular respiration is to convert the energy stored within the bonds that hold a glucose molecule together into usable cellular energy in the form of ATP. Essentially, what we're doing here is burning glucose to take ADP, adenosine diphosphate, plus inorganic phosphate, and recharge this molecule. I'm going to do a little... So we're using the energy of glucose to recharge ADP into ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and we're going to use that to do cellular work. So you can think of this kind of like glucose being the fire, the bonfire that we are burning, and ATP is more like a rechargeable battery. So we burn glucose and we don't get it back, but we use ATP and then we rephosphorylate it to recharge it up by burning more glucose. So why is this important to do? Well, we can't use the energy stored within the bonds of glucose to do useful cellular work. It's like visiting another country. If we were going to France, we couldn't just spend dollars on the streets of France. We'd have to convert our money to euros in order to buy goods and services there. So like that, a cell can't just spend the energy of glucose. It has to convert it into ATP in order to spend it to do useful cellular work. I just realized I never spelled cellular respiration all the way. Cellular respiration. There you go. Okay, so let's now look at the formulas for photosynthesis and cellular respiration and talk about the relationship between the two processes. So photosynthesis as you know, this is a simplified version of the equation. So here we go. 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus the energy from the sun are converted ultimately into C6H12O6 and 6O2. So C6H12O6 is glucose, and molecular oxygen is the O2. Now, you know from our intensive study of photosynthesis that this isn't quite true. This is an oversimplification. We're actually making pGal, but ultimately that pGal will become, or can become, glucose. So bear with me for a second. You'll see why I'm writing it this way. So here I've written the complete formula for cellular respiration. Notice that I've written aerobic in parentheses next to cellular respiration. You'll see later on that there are actually two different types of cellular respiration, aerobic and anaerobic. Aerobic is happening in the presence of oxygen, while anaerobic is happening without oxygen present. So the anaerobic pathway and chemical equation looks a little different from the aerobic. But we're going to start talking about the aerobic in our class. So here, take a look at this equation and notice something about the relationship between the chemical equation for photosynthesis and the chemical equation for cellular respiration. Now, I'm not going to explain this relationship to you, but I think that if you look at this for a little while and think about it, with a little bit of brain power, you'll see that there's a definite relationship between these two processes. If you need to just pause this screencast and look at this in silence, feel free. Okay, so now that you have thoroughly examined the chemical equation for photosynthesis and the chemical equation for cellular respiration, I want to take a brief pause to talk about the process of metabolism. Now, you've probably heard the word metabolism before, maybe in reference to, say, someone has a fast or a slow metabolism. Well, let's deconstruct metabolism a little bit because it's actually composed of two discrete parts. Metabolism is both anabolism as well as catabolism. Now, anabolism might sound familiar to you if you've ever heard of anabolic steroids. These are drugs that you can take to help you, for example, build muscle. So anabolism in general is the process of building things up. And we build things all the time in our bodies. If we're taking anabolic steroids, or even if we're just working out and lifting weights, we are building up our muscles. As we grow and develop from a small child to a large adult, we are growing and building ourselves in that process. Additionally, we're always recycling proteins, building up new proteins, creating new cell membrane. So anabolic processes are happening within our bodies all the time. Photosynthesis is an example of a process that is an anabolic process. This is the building of a glucose molecule from molecules of CO2. Now, as you know, not all organisms undergo photosynthesis. The things that we've talked about that perform photosynthesis are plants, protists, algae specifically, and some forms of bacteria. In general, we can call these groups of organisms our producers, or our primary producers, or also our autotrophs. Producers is probably an easier word to remember. So I want to put this in your mind for a second. All organisms, all living things undergo anabolism. It's necessary for all of us to build things up, to live. Particularly producers undergo photosynthesis, which is one specific example of anabolism. Okay, so now on to catabolism. If anabolism is the building of things, then catabolism is the opposite. It's the breaking down of things. Now, the conjunction of anabolism and catabolism, all the building of things, as well as the breaking of things, is your entire metabolism. All the processes that are happening within your body, both the constructive and the destructive. Now, catabolism isn't... Oh wait, let me backtrack for a second. And I would just like to say here that this process of anabolism uses energy, right? You have to put in energy in order to build something. However, the process of the catabolism releases energy. Breaking things down releases energy. Now, while all living things need anabolism, all living things also need catabolism. And like photosynthesis is an anabolic process, cellular respiration is a catabolic process. It breaks down glucose into useful cellular... It breaks down glucose and transforms that energy into usable cellular energy. Now, here's the thing. All living things undergo cellular respiration. It's a common misconception of students, or I guess people in general, that plants, producers, all our things that undergo photosynthesis are only using the process of photosynthesis, this anabolic process, to create glucose, and that they don't undergo cellular respiration. Well, this is false. All living things undergo cellular respiration in some form or another. If plants just built up this glucose and they didn't have a process to break it down, then this would be a silly investment. This glucose would be energetically inert. They wouldn't be able to do any work with it. It would be like being in France without euros and only dollars. plants need to be able to perform cellular respiration in order to spend the energy that's contained within glucose. So this is a key point here. All organisms undergo some form of cellular respiration. Okay, and I know this is a lot, but bear with me. There are a lot of terms and new things that I'm throwing at you, and it seems like it's a lot, but pretty soon you'll be comfortable with all these different words, and you'll see their relationship to one another. Okay, so last thing about cellular respiration. We are going to study two different forms of cellular respiration in this class, and one is aerobic, and the other is anaerobic. Now, again, these might be words that you are already familiar with if you've ever talked about anaerobic exercise or aerobic exercise. Well, aerobic just means O2 is present, and anaerobic means that O2 is not present. Now, the presence of oxygen allows the cell to fully break down, fully catabolize glucose. So the inputs for this pathway are C6H12O6, or glucose, plus 6H2O. We know that oxygen is present here, and that becomes 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus 36 or 38 ATP. We'll talk about why there's this difference between the amount of ATP produced in aerobic cellular respiration. Now, this equation you've already seen today, so you should be relatively comfortable with this one. Now, the equation for anaerobic cellular respiration is a little different because we don't have oxygen present, so we're not able to fully catabolize or break down glucose. So you can see here C6H12O6. We start out with glucose, same thing, but we don't have any oxygen, so I'm not going to put it in the equation. And we get out, here's another tricky part, two different things, depending on what type of organism you are. One thing you can get out is lactic acid and 2 ATP. This is the type of anaerobic respiration humans undergo, lactic acid fermentation. The other part, or the other kind of anaerobic respiration, is alcoholic fermentation, and the output of that is ethanol. Oops. CO2, but just one of them. Oh, sorry. I mean 2 of them, 2 CO2, plus 2 ATP. Now, you should notice here that aerobic respiration, aerobic cellular respiration, produces a lot more ATP than either lactic acid, anaerobic, or ethanol-based anaerobic cellular respiration. So, this is it. This is a lot of information. I think you can handle it, and we will be studying this more as we move into the future, so don't worry if it's not completely crystal clear yet. That's all. I will see you in class tomorrow.